There is a misconception that open source tools have to look hackery and have to look complicated. They were terrified that I would come in as a designer and I was gonna force them to make everything minimal, clean design, skeuomorphic design, glass morphism, that I was gonna force them to follow current design trends or whatever. Hello, I am Errol Fox. I am an open source designer, have been for about 7 years now, maybe a little bit longer. I'm a core maintainer at Open Source Design. I am really dedicated to how we bring designers into open source in more sustainable, long-term ways for the health of open source projects into the future. My first ever big grown-up job was in insurance, actually. I progressed through junior designer to middleweight designer to senior designer, design lead. I still hadn't found my place where I felt like I had a community of people around me. I first encountered open source in a proprietary commercial setting. It was because I was really curious about what my team of developers were doing. I was like, what's this thing that you're doing? A library? What's a library? Why are you choosing to use a library? And what does that mean for our project overall? And so I was like, that's great for them. The developers, the software engineers. It's great that they've got a place where they can collaborate, develop across borders, figure out solutions to problems that they didn't necessarily know how to solve themselves. Eventually, I got to the point where I was hired at an open source organization as a designer. I was like, hey, my design stuff is also on open repositories. The developers I'm working with get community involvement, get community contributions. There's all these people that don't work for us, but that work with us in open source. I want that. I want to know what designers are doing across the globe and how they can help contribute to what I'm working on, and vice versa. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about design in the tech world is that designers are always perfectionists. It can be true, it's not always true. And I think it's also one of the things that a lot of open source projects are afraid that designers will be when they come into the open source projects. There's this misconception that designers only want to redesign an entire project and that they won't want to work on smaller tasks or very targeted tasks about particular features. There's also a misconception that designers won't understand some of the technical details. So a lot of open source projects that have like APIs or maybe complex infrastructure or things like that, there's an assumption that designers won't be interested and that they won't be able to work on those kinds of things. And they really are interested if you spend the time to work with them and help them. Design isn't just about making things pretty. We're here to help solve problems for users. We're here to make things better. Sometimes that's about making things look incredibly beautiful. And sometimes it's about making a really small change to some kind of back-end admin infrastructure that is just about those seconds saved by a user in a critical function in a tool. The history of open source has very hacker roots, right? It's very much about building stuff that solves your problems, maybe for other people, and hacking things together a little bit. However you feel about the term hacker, is a personal choice. But there is the roots there about like building something, hacking together. And I think there is a misconception that open source tools have to look hackery and have to look complicated in their interfaces or in how they're interacted with. Otherwise, they won't seem as important or as critical as actually they are. So I've talked to a lot of open source projects when I've worked with them around the design aspects. And one of the things that a team said to me was they were terrified that I would come in as a designer and I was gonna force them to make everything minimal, clean design, skeuomorphic design, glass morphism, that I was going to force them to follow current design trends or whatever. And I was like, no, I'm not here to do that. There's a huge assumption, I think, that the command line interface, CLI for folks that aren't familiar, is something that doesn't need design. It's text input or it's functional inputs. There's so much important usability work, accessibility work, and design work to be done in the CLI. I think a big shock that people would be like, oh, this, misconception shock, is that designers are interested in figuring out those problems too. In open source, there's a unique kind of user that I encountered, and it's taken me a long time to get my head around this kind of user, which is the contributor user. So it's the user that not only uses, but that is involved. in the modification, the changing, the contribution. And I think that well-designed open source needs to consider what that user pathway is. Like, what does contribution mean? And are you different to a user that isn't contributing? This is where I think the history of like design, participatory design, co-design, it has such a beautiful connection to open source here because your users are your collaborators. The first one that comes to mind is when Mozilla did their open design project, when they had their rebranding a good number of years ago. I love that that is still all online to read because it's a really great moment of history of when a really big project, Mozilla, opened up its branding to the community and really involved people in how to choose where the direction of the visual treatment, the visual branding wanted to go. This is going to sound like it's planned, but I think the Canonical team are doing really, really well in leading the hiring designers and valuing what design does for an open source ecosystem here. The research that you're investigating at Canonical is really amazing around the design side of things. I think it's really important to show how important design is for the health of software and open source software. My last project that maybe I would promote is Pempot. As a design project is really leading, again, not only through beautiful UI, UX, usability, everything is a design tool that's open source, so it's kind of got it. But they really are prioritizing, again, that way of involving community, closing the gap between what it means to be a designer working in software and open source, and then what it means to be a coder, developer, whatever else you are in kind of open source or tech. Can I tell you a secret? So I think this is where design contributions for open source can really make an impact. User research, usability tests, user insights. It usually has a whole process where you invite people into an interview procedure or maybe a survey of some kind. Those are open source contributions when you give those user insights to open source tools. I don't think that a lot of people think that when they use a tool and they have some feedback or they participate in user research, I don't think they would consider that a contribution, but I certainly do. That is absolutely an open source contribution to a tool. But the second thing, if I might sneak in a second thing, is reach out to community, because I do think that there is a beautiful thing that happens in open source generally when people come together and collaborate. That's really arguably why we contribute to open source, is because we kind of want to meet other nerds that are really nerdy about the thing that we're nerdy about, and be it design, be it open source and design, be it developer tools, be it, you know, like an operating system. So really embrace like entering into the community and building connections there. Designers, developers, open source people, if you're liking what we're talking about, you should subscribe and like this video. Did I say subscribe?